Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and I've got a couple bins that I'd like to check in on. For a while there, every time we would feed the European night crawlers, we would bring all 4 bins of mine that I've got European night crawlers up to the bench and feed them at once. And that went on for a number of feedings, but it was only a few days ago that I took the 2 older systems that have European night crawlers in them. It's these 2 systems right here, and you could probably tell just from the way the material in the systems is arranged, they were set up for horizontal migration, so they've finally gotten to that point where I'm prepared to try to get the worms to move out of their finished casting so they could get rounded up and get moved out. However, the 2 younger ones that they were getting fed together with during those check-ins for a while are the ones that live down here in these 2 black bins underneath. These are somewhat younger bins that still have a way to go. These 2 systems, the older one on the left is 224 days of age, and the younger one here on the right is exactly 200 days of age today. And it's been a couple weeks now since we checked in on all 4 systems. Like I said, the 2 older ones got started on their migration 4 days ago, but now, 14 days later, since that last check-in and feeding, I believe that these 2 younger systems are probably due for a feeding, so I grabbed some of my stuff from the freezer. I grabbed a few banana peels, and I grabbed some spent coffee. And that's going to be their feeding. So I'm going to get these bins up onto the bench and we're going to get them fed. So let's get to work. So these newspaper coverings sitting on top are really just meant to provide darkness underneath the somewhat translucent plastic coverings that you see here. And the purpose of the plastic coverings, as you might imagine, is to help the systems hang on to their moisture content and not let it be lost to evaporation. In many of my systems, well, not many, but in some of my systems, I've been steering away from the use of plastic coverings and swapping them out for paper only, possibly cardboard, because I notice, at least here in my house, once the summer season starts to roll in, actually right now we're still a couple weeks away from the official start of summer. We've already had the unofficial start of summer here in the United States. We treat the Memorial Day holiday as the unofficial start of summer. But the official start of summer is still a couple weeks away, so we're somewhere in between those 2 points in time. And here and there we have some cool weather, at which point the furnace still does kick on and try to heat the house, but for the most part I'm expecting to see very little, if any, of that in the coming weeks and months as the warmer weather rolls in. And because of that, I think that the air in the house is going to start to get more and more humid, because the furnace definitely dries the air in the house. So I'm wondering if I might end up doing the same thing in here as I've done in some of my other systems, which is to do away with the plastic coverings and maybe put only paper coverings over the top to let the systems release some of their moisture content. Right off the bat, I'm definitely sensing excessive moisture, that's for sure, you know. As far as I'm concerned, the material in your worm bin should not look like this. So don't treat this as like a really good shiny example of what you want a worm bin to look like. Way too much moisture going on here. And I'm sure that the worms aren't going to complain about it, because the worms definitely love the moisture. However, the material gets a little bit unmanageable when it's like this, you know. It doesn't really flow readily. It also makes me worry a little bit that it doesn't have enough air, ventilation, airflow, if you will, throughout it, which could lead to some sort of bad decomposition processes, like, you know, anaerobic decomposition. That's just decomposition that happens without the presence of oxygen, and that's kind of an unhealthy environment for a worm bin, and it's something you would want to try to avoid. So I'm definitely sensing more moisture in here than we would want to see. I'm definitely going to be leaving the plastic coverings off, and I'm going to be trying to steer these systems towards some drying. Now down here in the younger of the 2 systems, we've been running a compostable bag in here, and this thing in here how long has it been going now? And is it still one piece? Yeah, this is something else. So this compostable bag has a couple worms hanging out on it. Whether or not they're actually eating it or not, or it's actually composting in here or not, I couldn't tell you for sure. Here and there I try to see if I can observe any sort of deterioration or decomposition. I've already started observing a couple of these holes developing in the compostable bag, but whether or not that's actual decomposition or composting that's happening there, I don't know. It might just have been me being overly rough and tearing holes into it by accident. Because whenever I'm running a sort of experimental object like this in my bins to see how it breaks down, or if it'll break down in my worm bins, I'll generally avoid trying to handling it roughly so that I can actually observe how composting breaks it down over time versus how I could possibly break it down over time. So I've been doing my best to avoid handling that compostable bag in a rough way that would contribute to its breakdown, or even, form holes or anything else like that. So those couple of holes that you see in there, I believe they've been in there for some time now. And even here I'm starting to see some leftovers of some previous feedings. Here too is the stem of an old banana that would have been put in there some time ago. These few pieces of leftover we found look like they were the leftovers of some cantaloupe rinds that were put in here. This is more of the same, I believe. Here too I could see some stems of leaves. I'm curious to see if we're going to have a very similar overly damp situation in this system here, the older bin. Well, I'm afraid it's more of the same. It is unfortunate. I should have been more careful, and I got to be careful now in all my systems. You get so used to the winter months when the air in the house is so dry that it just tends to suck the moisture out of your systems. So you feel like you're kind of trying to compensate for that all the time. But then when the furnace stops running and the humidity and the air in the house rises, then the worm bins are just going to hang on to their moisture much more readily and become quite possibly more damp than you would want them to be. And that, I believe, is what we're observing here in these two systems. So yeah, the plastic coverings will not be coming back on today. We had those 2 sheets of newspaper sitting out on top that we can reuse as just sort of top coverings that will permit some moisture to pass through them. And I think that'll be it. In fact, I'm kind of tempted just to leave these things completely uncovered so that drying could really start happening in here, because it really wouldn't hurt for these systems to kick off a good bit of their moisture, because they're way more damp than I want them to be, and I'd like to see them start drying immediately. I'd like for that drying to happen quickly rather than over a long, prolonged period of time. I tell you, I came in here prepared to use some of my prepared bedding, which is usually prepared with moisture, so the stuff is kind of damp. I am tempted at this point just to come in here with some dry cardboard and use that as the bedding. So I've got some of that as well that we could use, and I believe that might actually be our game plan here, to include some bone dry bedding, which maybe, I don't know, might have the potential to suck some moisture into itself, and I don't know, possibly help bring things back into control down here from a moisture perspective, because this is somewhat out of control if you ask me, the moisture content in these systems. I just hope that this isn't what I start seeing in all my systems across the board. Although I must admit, I have been starting to observe this sort of exceedingly high moisture level in a bunch of my systems. So yeah, you know what? Forget the prepared bedding that's got moisture content. I'm going for my just freshly shredded cardboard paper mix. This doesn't even have leaves in it. This is just paper and cardboard straight out of the shredder. And I believe that this is what we're going to use here, in the hopes that maybe it manages to absorb some of the moisture in this system. And instead of just putting it in a big pile like I usually do and then drop the food on it, I'm thinking I might layer in some of this more damp stuff so that there's dry stuff sort of blended in with this somewhat muddy material. It'll definitely help the moisture content work its way into the drier materials more quickly this way, I believe, rather than just having a whole bunch of dry material resting down at the bottom of the bin. And I'm even wondering if maybe beyond just the feeding zone here where we're going to drop in the foods, maybe we can even go throughout the whole system and drop a little bit of this dry stuff in here and there, because I believe it would definitely help. But you know what, as long as we're dealing with the feeding zones, we might as well get the food down in there too before we fill the feeding zones up so much that we leave ourselves no space to add food. So why don't we bring in first the coffee into each system. And this can get blended in a little bit like so. The coffee is coming in with a little bit of moisture content, but not a whole lot, that's for sure. And it's usually down here in the feeding zone that I plop in this compostable bag in the hopes that the food will contribute to the traffic in the area as the worms come to eat the food items that are in here. They'll hopefully also spend a little time working on the compostable bag to help that break down further. But you know, who knows? It's hard to say, because some people tell me that they try putting those types of compostable bags down into their worm bins and months go by. They observe little or no progress and they just end up pulling the thing out in the end. So that could very well end up being the way it turns out happening here too, but I'm not really prepared to cancel the test yet. I think we're okay to continue with it for a while. So I believe out here too, out in the far edges, we're going to kind of do the same as what we did down in the feeding zone. We're going to try to layer in a little bit of dry material in the hopes that it absorbs some of this excess moisture and maybe helps us get to a point in these bins that's a little bit more aligned with what I like to see in my worm bins, so we don't have as much moisture and such muddy, clumpy material down in the bins. And I'm sure that the worms are just going to appreciate this nice bedding material all over the place anyway, so they're not going to complain about it. I really hope that this helps. Alrighty. Not that it's such a chronic situation. I mean, maybe I'm making more out of it than I need to. But it does seem like if this goes unchecked for a long time, it could lead to bigger problems. And I believe that in general, it is best for the material in the worm bins to remain kind of loose and flowing and not get muddy and clumpy as we see here. So the one end of the bin that we've not yet really had a chance to examine is what's closest to me. So I think we're going to do something quite similar over here, which is just layer in some more dry materials in the hopes that it'll help collect up some of the system's excessive moisture. And we're just going to have our fingers crossed between now and the next check-in, hoping that we see some improvement in here. The other thing we'll be doing, as I mentioned earlier, is not replacing the plastic coverings and possibly covering up with only the newspapers that were out there for the purposes of providing the systems with darkness under the plastic. At this point, they'll just be the only coverings that these systems have. And, well, you know, I've already kind of backfilled the feeding area where we've placed in some of the coffee. I'm thinking as long as we've got this edge excavated, perhaps we'll just go with an edge type feeding on this go around and place the banana peels over on this side, and we'll just mark it that way to remind ourselves where we last fed in here. So I've got a couple coffee filters as you saw a moment ago. We'll just go ahead and we'll plop those coffee filters in here as indicators to show ourselves where we last fed, so that we can be reminded of it next time we come back in here and see how things are coming along. So Little deviation from my normal mode of operations. Normally I'm kind of feeding down the middle in most of my systems. Here I guess we're just going to be deviating slightly because it really doesn't matter so much where the food gets placed in. At this point there is food in the middle, there's food on the edge closer to me, and there's pretty much fresh bedding been placed in everywhere. I'm even wondering if maybe just scattering some fresh dry bedding material out across the top surface might be beneficial too. I've got some leafy material that we could use that way, perhaps further absorbing some moisture into itself, although out on the surface I doubt that it would do much. Yeah, you know, why don't we do that? This is what I got here. It's very fine leafy material, not the sort of stuff that you normally see me applying to my systems. I'm even tempted to blend it in a little bit. Maybe it'll help absorb some of the stuff that's out here on the surface, or absorb some of the moisture that's in the material that's out here on the surface. So otherwise the stuff might just sit out on the surface and sit there and be dry and not serve much of a purpose at all by being dry. Perhaps this way, by being blended into the material a little bit, the worms will actually be able to utilize it as a food source too. And then we could start coming back in with these coffee filters we saw earlier. I'm going to place them on these edges over here just to show that the majority of the food was placed out here on the further edge, those banana peels. You know, admittedly there was some leftovers and some coffee placed over near the middle, so maybe we'll just position it there. It's a little bit more accurately placed. And you know, I had my grit here on standby, ready to go, but I got distracted. Perhaps we'll just be okay not using any of it. We'll just go with it as is. And as far as that castings material that's stuck to the plastic that we removed in the beginning, I think I'll go ahead and I'll just drape those out so that they dry enough that I could just flake off all the casting material off those plastic pieces and return them to these systems at some point. That might take a while. So we're going to leave those to dry, and I'll come back at some point later in the day to see if the material has dried and loosened enough that I can maybe just flake it back off into these systems. And since that's sort of pending work that needs to get done, I'm not even going to put these systems back up on the shelf. I'm going to leave it out here so that I can tend to that little to-do item a little bit later. But besides that, I've got some cleaning up to do, and then I'll be able to put stuff away. But I'm not going to keep you around for those things. Those things are boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. If you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks so much for watching. Bye now.